As we fight through hordes of formidable enemies on the planet of Rubicon 3 during the Coral War, one thing is constantly present, whether we are seeing it or others are talking about it. I am of course talking about Coral. What exactly is Coral, and why are the various factions we encounter fighting to the last man over it? It is fundamental to understand exactly what Coral is, as the understanding will establish a greater comprehension of the entire universe and lore of Armored Core 6. There's a lot of lore to cover in AC6, but in this short video, we'll focus on Coral itself and some of the events surrounding it in somewhat chronological order so that there's less confusion. There will be spoilers in this video as a heads up, and if you want to check out my other lore videos for games like Starfield or the Elder Scrolls franchise, definitely feel free to do so. We are introduced early to the backdrop of a cataclysmic event called the Fires of Ibis, which were so hot that it burnt entire star systems, including the stars themselves, throughout some part of the known galaxy. As implied by the lore of Armored Core 6, entire populations of millions, probably billions of humans were wiped out or affected by the Fires of Ibis. The source of the Fires of Ibis is Coral, which is now reappearing or being rediscovered on the planet of Rubicon 3. We come to discover later as we explore Rubicon 3 that the organization called Rubicon Research Institute and one of its head professors, Nagai, experimented with and researched Coral. When Nagai remarks on the potentials of Coral, he notices that there are mutations and skyrocketing growth in Coral. No one at this point in time fully knows what exactly happens if you let Coral keep exponentially growing. So in a unilateral decision, the Rubicon Research Institute set fire to the Coral, leading to the Fires of Ibis, consuming Rubicon 3 and presumably destroying whatever remained of Coral. However, 50 years later, Coral is rediscovered, and it sparks the Coral War, where the corporations, the All Might mercenary group, the Rubiconian Liberation Front made up of Rubiconian natives, and then the Planetary Closure Administration go to war. This is a theater we enter as an outdated Generation 4 augmented mercenary under the command of Handler Walter. Now you might be wondering why we humans, dumb as we are, would keep going after such a dangerous resource at this point. As we stumble upon more and more instances of Coral, it appears to be a swirling, light but dense, yet not dense, massive red gas and crimson auroras as indicated by its ability to stay up in the atmosphere once drawn. However, to everybody else not in tune or augmented with Coral, it may not look like this, as scanners are used to detect Coral by corporations and Handler Walter, which is implied by the fact that you can see large swathes of Coral in the air only after Air, your companion, is introduced. As we discover more about how AC pilots can be surgically augmented with Coral, we learn that Coral isn't just a regular source of material or energy like oil that can power engines or other machinery. It's a source of energy that can essentially self-replicate or reproduce, which means it's potentially unlimited energy if it's kept growing in certain conditions, such as the underground deposits or the vacuum of space, which explains why corporations like Archivist are drawing it up with a massive planet straw. Of course, there's a downside to Coral as a source of energy, as its volatile nature can make it rather combustible. If there's enough of it to be sparked, then we get another Fires of Ibis event. What's actually even more interesting and can get quite complex about Coral is that mutations within it can manifest as consciousness that's clearly sentient and sapient. An example of this is your companion Air, who describes herself as a Rubiconian, which is a label that could be applied to either the Rubiconian human natives who were living on Rubicon before and after the Fires of Ibis, such as Carla, or beings of Coral that can communicate with pre-5th generation Coral augmented humans. Either is open for interpretation, though I lean towards the former as Air desperately tries to wake us up so that our consciousness doesn't scatter into the Coral, implying that one could become a Coral Rubiconian at some point later in time, post-assimilation. Air also describes herself as a single wave born from the Coral Tide who is a Rubiconian without a body. Remnants of her fellow Rubiconians' consciousnesses or other mutation waves could be in the Coral, indicated by her describing the Coral conversions as her family or brothers and sisters. She also seems more human than some sort of sentient gaseous being with her mannerisms and dialogue, although she acknowledges her instinct to converge with other Coral, which explains why coral also gathers in large numbers as if they were made up of social creatures. Of course, we could also speculate that air could potentially not have been a former human, but I feel like this aspect of coral could definitely be explored in a different lore video. The existence of air or sentience within coral has some weird implications when you put it within the context of what the various characters and groups in Armored Core 6 are trying to accomplish. For example, when Handler Walter dismisses us hearing air's voice as a potential defect from the older generation of augmentation, it doesn't seem like anyone except ourselves and maybe a few characters like G5 Iguazu know that some instances of coral can be sentient or at least communicate. It's a little perturbing to acknowledge, but this fact, even if it was widely known, would not matter in my opinion, as humans are always afraid of what they don't understand or are too fearful of the future. Which is why Handler Walter and Carla, under the Overseer organization, would probably try to destroy the coral anyway. Corporations would probably still ruthlessly harvest coral and happily continue to shed blood for profits, whereas the Planetary Closure Administration would still seek to control and regulate the coral by closing off other groups' access to it. Meanwhile, the fact that the dozers use coral to manufacture drugs is given a new context. Are you snorting or injecting drugs made of potential consciousness or Rubiconians into your body? The resistance by the Rubiconian Liberation Front is also given some new context, as the so-called Coral Warriors and Martyrs aren't just fighting the corporations and other foreign powers. They're not just fighting back against oppressors who have implemented re-education camps for both civilians and prisoners of war. The human Rubiconians aren't also just fighting for their homes or survival, as coral is needed to raise mealworms for their sustenance. Most of them are unknowingly still fighting for their families, friends, and communities who may now be a part of coral. The very fact that we ourselves are infused or augmented with coral takes on a whole new meaning as well, because even if we were to try and destroy all of the coral on Rubicon 3, it would eventually propagate from any of the augmented AC pilots. Lastly, coral is also a data conduit as stated in the game. This means information and data can be transmitted through and with coral. Think of coral as not made up of consciousness or data, but merely a container for those things. During one of the historic data recovery missions, it stated that coral is able to conduct data and is able to influence digital equipment, which also explains why air's ability to handle mission briefings and manipulate or explore things around us, while it also explains how coral, and by extension water or air, can control ACs. In the true ending of Armored Core 6, the accumulation and growth of coral reaches a breaking point where the density of the mass of coral leads to what seems to be a black hole that leads to the scattering of coral out across the infinite expanse of space, which means it's now an almost impossible task for humanity to try to extinguish, as reproduction and replication will continue at an exponential pace, and perhaps attempting to destroy coral at a certain point would set the galaxy alight, and now we humans must try to figure out a way to perhaps live in mutual symbiosis with coral. The potential future of this is up for debate and is purposely left vague, but it's clear from the mission title of Alia Jacta Est, which means the die is cast in Latin, that the future is open and up for grabs, while simultaneously denying the desires of the multiple individuals and groups in the Coral War to destroy or exploit or amass the coral. And that's it. If you want a deeper dive into coral, or even want me to look at other lore in Armored Core 6, please just let me know down in the comments below. I've been enjoying AC6 after doing a game review for it, which you can also watch on the channel if you're curious about the rating I gave it, and I've been enjoying poking around the lore and seeing other people's discussions about AC6. If you'd like to support me, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and see you out on the field, fellow Ravens.